Welcome back to News Talk Saga 960 AM. I'm your host, Jason Thom, as we head into the home stretch of the NPH Hour. If you've listened to this program before, you know that I have always championed the fact that basketball is, in my opinion, the most inclusive sport in the world. We see players from some of the most underfunded nations in the world churning out players that not only play in the NBA, but become MVPs and lead their teams to championships. But I also want to focus on the fact that the men's game at the highest levels has focused more on including women in every facet of the operations, where maybe 30 years ago, having females involved in office and administrative roles seemed progressive. Now, we see opportunities being provided at every different position in frontline basketball. Over the last 2 NBA off seasons, San Antonio Spurs assistant coach Becky Hammon has been a leading candidate for multiple head coaching positions in the league. And while some could argue that a few organizations did that in order to appear progressive, there is one thing I truly believe. The NBA will be the first league of the 4 major sports in North America to have a woman as a head coach for a men's team. And Hammon, the first full-time female assistant coach in the NBA, who also became the first female to be the head coach in an NBA game after, shockingly, Greg Popovich was ejected from a game in December of 2020, will likely be the person to break through that current barrier. While we wait for that to happen, there are a number of other women getting opportunities at other levels of the game, at different positions. And here in Canada, we have a number of people doing that exact same thing. One of those people is Winta Desta, a former player from the USports ranks who wanted to stay involved in the game. And like many Canadians that are former players, she got into coaching on the women's side. She was also a physiotherapist for some teams. But where I first saw her was on the sidelines for a boys prep team, where we are seeing more and more women on the bench. But her story did not start or end there. And I wanted to have her on the show to illustrate to young men and women that not knowing your end goal in the game of basketball should not stop you from starting your pathway to wherever it may lead, and that gaining skills from positions as a trainer, coach, skills coach, advanced scout, whatever it is, can help you as the industry grows here in Canada. Winta's future may not be in coaching at all, but the skills she is gaining from that or has gained from that are going to help her in the different roles that she may get. As you will hear, it's also important to affect change at the grassroots level, because the more things change at the youngest age groups, the more commonplace it seems at the next level. And if you want to follow your passion in sport, but in a different role than actually playing the game, you will need to sacrifice and commit in the exact same ways that players do when they're chasing their dreams. I think it's important to illustrate to young people out there how important it is to kind of take advantage of every opportunity. Like, say maybe you want to be a scout or you want to be an agent, to understand that to get to that end goal, there's a lot of different things you got to do. And you're a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I started off like a lot of people as a player, and played in high school and played in university, in USports, which was CIS back then, but now USports. And I was not a great player. I was a good player, but I knew that in order to stay involved in basketball, I was going to have to divert from the playing world. And, I started coaching when I was doing my master's. So I was a full-time student and sort of, reached out to my network of, past players that I knew were coaching, and got lucky that, one of my colleagues / friends was looking for an assistant coach and sort of brought me on with one of his girls teams at the time. And sort of like paid my dues / showed that I was capable of coaching. And then sort of he, asked me to continue with him with another team of his going forward. And that's sort of where it started. But I think, as a player, especially if you're a varsity player at a university, like you're always going to have some coaching you're doing, like whether it's kids camps or whatnot, like you start that relatively early. So it's like, you know, you already have skills, and not to be afraid to take those and like, you know, bet on yourself, for lack of better words, and use it.
One thing I think the younger generation doesn't understand now either is the value of volunteer time. And it's something that, I mean, when I got into mainstream sports media, the only way I got there was volunteering for years. I think that's something in your background as well, being around other people who are willing to sacrifice their time and maybe money they think they should be earning in order to volunteer, and what that brings you.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And if you look at like any sport industry leader, like there are very few who like just landed a full-time paid job in sport. Like everyone has sort of, you know, for lack of better words, paid their dues. But part of it is like being able to get experiences in sort of lower stake areas, right? And sort of build up your resume, but also like giving back to the game. Cause like chances are the people who coached you were not getting paid. I know they definitely weren't. And they were putting their own money on the line to help support our teams. And like, you know, unfortunately right now, as it stands, there aren't very many paying jobs in basketball in Canada. That's slowly changing. But, you know, as that does change, those people who have been volunteering for years and years are going to be the people in the front of the line for a lot of those positions because they have the experience, right? So, I mean, there's value in being able to give back. There's value in being able to get that experience while giving back. And, you know, I made sure that I was in school or I was working while doing it, so I wasn't losing out financially too much. And you just have to sort of strike a balance.
The saying I always use, and I love hearing it now, is funding your passion, right? Working that paid job in order to follow your passion with the volunteer time. And it's definitely a secret for success. And you know, we're seeing more and more women's coaches on men's team staffs, but at the teenage level, like high school aged boys, that's where I first saw you coaching. And I was very impressed with some things that I saw in that game from a managing personnel perspective. It's not easy for anyone to coach young men. Mm-hmm. What challenges did you face, and how did that maybe make you a better coach as a result?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, early on, I would say the majority of the challenges I faced were not necessarily because I was a female coach, were more because I was a new coach and, you know, maybe lacked a little bit of confidence with some of the X's and O's and all that kind of stuff. But I think bigger, like environmentally and, you know, systemically, like going into games or tournaments and other people just assuming you weren't the leader in that situation was always something like you felt you always had to put like you're always putting your best foot forward, but you had to do a little bit more. You know, like if I was going on an AAU tournament, like, and you were registering for the first day, a lot of times are like, are you the mom? Or are you the manager versus like one of the coaching staff? So that I dealt with that a lot earlier on. And then, you know, as time went around and people were more familiar with me, then it was less and less so. But yeah, those were probably the bigger challenges in terms of like dealing with personalities, like, you know, early on, I think, like I said, it was more because I was more green than anything. And I got a little bit of pushback, which is fair because, you know, sometimes things I called or stuff like that wasn't necessarily the most appropriate, but it was less so than me being a woman, more so because it was just the wrong play call or whatnot. Right. And looking back on it, I've come to realize that maybe in the moment, that's not exactly how I felt. But like you know, the biggest for me is like building relationships. And I'd say honestly, with the majority of, you know, the boys teams that I've coached, I've had really good relationships with most of my players, and just like meeting them where they're at, and you know, how you handle yourself on the court. You know, you have to obviously, you know, be more disciplined and whatnot, but then being able to be really personable with them and support them off the court is, you know, I think what one of my strengths has been and why I've sort of stuck around as long as I have. Yeah. And I found it a very, you know, I have a younger brother who's very similar in age of the players I've coached. So I feel like he's always like the first person first boy I coached. And, you know, I think when you meet people where they're at and then you show them that you want to help them, those are the biggest things, and you can learn. You get better at the X's and O's. I'm definitely way better now than I was when I started.
I love the honesty, right?
Mhm.
Like, and I don't think we hear that enough. People see people being successful and they think, oh, that just happens, right? They don't see the stumbles along the way. And I think the one thing I want to focus on as well is the impact that you have because you're coaching young men. So when they get to the next level and they have a female coach at the NCAA level or at the pro level, it's not new to them. Is that something that you were able to think about at the time? Or like you said, now looking back, you're like, okay, like I'm having an impact beyond just myself and the people I'm coaching. I'm impacting the game as a whole.
Definitely did not cross my mind in the moment, because I guess you get sort of lasered in and
you're busy.
what you have to do. But looking back, like I had one player that I coached on one of my first AAU teams who, once he went to NCAA, was playing college. Like one of his assistant coaches was a female, and she was a woman, and she now very recently is now coaching in the NBA. So it's like you're going to have a woman coach at some point in your career, probably now. And I think, with the guys that I coached more recently, some of them had admitted like they were like a bit skeptical at first. And then once they sort of like were like, oh, you know what, actually, there's really no difference. And I think that sort of initial reaction is going to change going forward. But I've never had big issues, and it's really cool to sort of see that trend, and people and women coaches being like comfortable to put themselves out there to be in that role, because really at the end of the day it's just basketball. And I've coached on the women's side as well, which a lot of people sometimes don't know because they assume I just coach on the boys side, and it's really at that point is just dealing with different personalities and people, but the basketball is the same.
And that's what I wanted to hit on, the fact that you mentioned you were a former player, and now with girls now seeing women in these different roles, they're understanding that the industry is growing, and if they can't play the game as a pro, there's other things that they can do to stay involved. But I mean, that probably wouldn't happen if you didn't stay involved in playing the game. And how important is it to keep these young girls playing, especially through that early teenage years where we lose so many girls who give up the game?
Yeah, I think it's so important for not just, physically being a part of the game, but also, whether it's for your mental health or staying more fit or more physically active. Like there's so many benefits to keeping girls in sport. And there are a bunch of statistics that girls who end up staying in sport, hold different types of roles in the corporate world or what have you. And I can't rattle that off the top of my head, but you end up being more well-rounded people in the long run, because sport just, you just get exposed to so much in sport. You get exposed to different people in different environments. You travel, there's obviously a lot of adversity through sports. So then when you see them in your personal life or your work life, you're already up for that challenge, and you've sort of navigated so many different waters at that point. So I think, for me, sport definitely helped me be more resilient. But also I think it gave me a very sort of diverse experience, like diverse people experiences that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise, which is really cool.
And coming out of the pandemic, which seems to hopefully be happening now here in this country, how important is it to make sure that girls specifically are back playing this sport as well? Because it's a long period of time where they're maybe away from it. Is there something that, advice maybe you have of maybe there's a girl out there thinking, well, it was fun while I was doing it, but now I don't really have, the thought to go back into it.
I think the biggest thing is like, put yourself back in those shoes of when you were playing and remember how fun it was. Like at the end of the day, when we're talking about kids and teens in sport, their main, reason for being in it is because it's fun. Right. And I'm biased, but I think there are very few things that match that fun factor than sport when you're in your teenage years. And, it can hold so many different opportunities at the end of the road for past your playing career or what have you, that, to give it up in the short term because you missed out on a year, I think is not fair to yourself. And I think just giving it a go. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go back into competitive or go back to the same sport, right? Just trying something and staying active is, like I said, good for you for so many different reasons.
Winta Desta, physiotherapist, coach, mentor, volunteer. You're doing whatever it takes to make your dreams a reality. And whether you know it or not, you're inspiring the next generation along the way. And thank you so much for coming on the NPH Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
That was Winta Desta, a name that you will be hearing from a lot more over the next little while, I think, and I really hope telling her story will help inspire or clarify things for some young people who want to get involved with the sport in different ways, or for players transitioning out of their time on the floor but want to put all their skills to work in the sport that they love. Winta was also involved with the Guelph Nighthawks of the Canadian Elite Basketball League, which is a great place for people to get involved at the pro level here in Canada, and something that really wasn't around just a few years ago. There is no better time to get involved in Canadian basketball than right now. That is all the time we have for today. Find out more about North Pole Hoops at northpolehoops.com, at North Pole Hoops on Instagram, and at NPH Scouting on Twitter. I'm at _ Jason Thom, and the NPH Hour. We'll be back next week here on News Talk Saga 960 AM.